Welcome to the first presentation of National Coin Weeks in 2023. Every day this week, we'll have a new presentation to help everyone celebrate. I hope you can make it to all of them. During this presentation, you may come up with some questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your question, as all of you are going to be muted for the presentation. Your question will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Jesse Kraft, who is the Resolute Americana Assistant Curator of American Numismatics at the American Numismatic Society, where his duties include coins, tokens, metals, and paper currencies from all of the Western Hemisphere. Jesse will be presenting on redefining national identity, metals in the United States, 1876 to 1932. And with that, it's all yours, Jesse.
Doug, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for having me this evening. I'm going to share my screen really quick. I can remember how to do that. There's that. And there it is. All right, there we go. So first thing, I do have to make a small caveat. As Doug just said, my presentation is, or should I say, was redefining national identity metals in the United States, 1876 to 1932. As it turns out, I'm getting over a brief medical problem, so I did not have as much time to prepare as I would have liked to. So that said, I had to shorten my time frame. So I am just going to be looking at redefining national identity, metals of the 1876 Centennial Exposition. So with my shortened time frame, I shortened the time frame, but still looking at basically the same phenomenon. So that said, it kind of goes hand in hand because I'm talking about redefining, and I had to redefine my topic. So that said, the general overview for this topic, or for this presentation, is going to be revolving around the aftermath of the American Civil War, and in the wake of the Reconstruction period, the United States celebrated its centennial in 1876. In an effort to forget the recent past, which is, of course, the American Civil War and the Reconstruction, while also celebrating and redefine its national identity, symbolism avoided anything related to war, especially, and even Lincoln to a large degree. If you can think of an 1876 Lincoln medal, you probably know your medals pretty well because there aren't too many. In lieu of avoiding the obvious, symbolism looked at earlier periods, solidifying the origin story, and found new symbols to identify as important to the nation. And I will be looking at three in particular. There are others, but I'm looking at George Washington, the city of Philadelphia, and liberty. And there's kind of two different liberties that I'm looking at, which we will see. So first, what is national identity? According to the Oxford Dictionary, national identity is the sense of, quote, a nation as a cohesive whole, as represented by distinctive traditions, culture, and language. And just traditions, culture, and language are all things that you can find on metals. So metals and the metallic arts really do fit well into finding a national identity. Within this, what we're going to be talking about is national consciousness, which is the shared sense of national identity. So national identity is what one person feels, whereas national consciousness is that feeling shared by a large degree of people. This is a quote unquote imagined community, as you know, it doesn't actually exist except in the sense that we can talk about it, and by talking about it is what kind of creates this national consciousness. So generally, positive symbols and aspects are only considered when you're talking about your national identity or national consciousness. You really try to avoid negative things. So that goes hand in hand with the topic and kind of the thesis of this presentation, where in 1876, the United States as a whole wanted to forget about the Civil War and its aftermath in the years of celebration. That said, national identity is a social construct, and that kind of goes hand in hand with this quote unquote imagined community. So national identity in 1876. I'm going to give you two little quotes here. Both of them are by modern historians talking about 1876. These are not quotes by people in 1876, but they are it still gives you a good idea of what was happening at this time by people who have also studied it. So this is by historian Michael Kamen, who says that, quote, political values and institutions were at the core of American national identity in 1876. And he goes on to say, political authority had been such a powerful determinant of national identity in 1876. So as we'll see, and these are very clear on the medallic arts of this period, political values and authority and institutions, that was the key to identifying what our nation meant at this kind of pivotal moment. Second quote here, short quote by historian Robert Rydell. The Centennial exhibition was also a nation-building enterprise that sought to give form and substance to a new sense of a national identity and unity after America's devastating Civil War. So that really goes, to the point of what we're talking about here. Medals helped serve this purpose. So while Robert Rydell is talking kind of broadly, this presentation, of course, is going to be talking about the medallic arts. So George Washington, every time I look at this picture, it makes me chuckle more and more. George Washington represents the viability of the revolutionary cause and respect for such essential political principles as civilian control of the military and decentralization of power, by another modern historian who says that. And we'll see this. There are kind of two forms of Washington that go hand in hand in this nation building and nation rebuilding exercise that happens at this period. Washington as Cincinnatus and Washington as Pater Patriae. One of those deals with the war, the other deals with kind of the political founding of the country. So the first is Washington as Cincinnatus, and this talks about Cincinnatus is the legendary Roman soldier Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, who Washington was compared to immediately after the war. Washington is very, very famous for being one of the first kind of modern political leaders to help found the nation and then lay down his arms and go back to being a regular citizen after being, then he becomes president, of course, but at the time they didn't necessarily know that. So even in 1783, he was connected to this Roman historical figure, Cincinnatus, and medals and other things were created. This particular medal dates from the 1890s, but it's based on designs from the 1780s, and is actually engraved. This particular set of dies was engraved by Victor David Brenner, who later went on to design the Lincoln Cent, of course. So this is Washington as Cincinnatus. This is him as the war hero who saved our country, or really founded our country, and then laid down his arms, went back to Virginia and became a farmer. We can see this portrayed down here at the bottom. Really, the picture on the right is kind of the obverse, but the picture on the left, or the side on the left, kind of looks more like an obverse. So it's generally portrayed as the obverse, but the picture on the right, or the coin, the metal side on the right, shows Washington being asked to be the soldier and help found the country. And then on the left, we see Washington throwing down his arms and walking back to his farm. Above, we see the symbolic allegorical figure of fame, trumpeting, proclaiming Washington's fame as Cincinnatus. The second one, however, is much, much more common in the medallic arts. Washington as Pater Patriae, or the founding fathers, is literally what that translates to in Latin. Washington as the founding father of the United States. As we talk about in history classes and elsewhere about founding fathers, plural. In this case, Washington is the founding father, and there's really no others. As we can see here, we have a brand new Washington Quarter of 2023, and even here, it is Washington as the founding father, not as Cincinnatus, which is his other symbolic figure. 1876 was not the beginning of Washington being used as the founding father. In fact, this picture to the right dates from the 1830s, the painting. However, there is a very, very huge uptick in portrayals of Washington in this manner for the Centennial exhibitions. going to go through a handful of slides that just show the variety. Here we actually have the same exact bust, but used in two very different metals, different compositions, different inscriptions, and different other aspects to the design. So really, really interesting. As you can see, they can be on the crude side. The picture on the left, or the metal on the left, is the same style bust as the previous two, you can see, but is just a little bit more crude. The bust on the right is a 3/4 right view, which is always kind of difficult to portray in the medallic arts to begin with, but this one isn't necessarily the most pleasing picture of Washington either. Here we can see a few others that are very, very well executed. Some of them, you see the picture on the metal on the right, is almost being deified there, almost treated as a godlike figure, with the cherubs kind of almost, christening him to some degree. Here to further quote unquote metals, these are actually not even metal with a T, but these are actually both made out of wood. These are large, I think they're 62 millimeters, or almost 4-inch metals that are actually made out of wood. We have some of the dies actually for these at the INS collection, which are pretty neat. There are many, many more examples. I only gave a small handful. Here's one of the trays for the 1876 exhibitions in particular. There's got to be hundreds of different examples that revolve around Washington and the 1876 exhibition in particular. Washington was important, obviously, to the United States, the founding, but also to the Reconstruction period. He was always well loved as our founding father before the Civil War, but in the Civil War, he kind of took on a really, really interesting kind of role where he was claimed by both the North and the South. The North could claim him because the North was still the United States and Washington founded the United States. The South can claim him because he was from Virginia, and Virginia at that time was part of the Confederate States of America. So it was really, really this interesting kind of persona developed between the two counterparts of the American Civil War. In 1876, he was also kind of used as a unifying, almost a band-aid for this, in that role as well, because he could have been claimed by both people as a founder of that, area. It kind of helped solidify and helped heal what was happening in the aftermath of the Civil War. So Washington's role is very important, obviously, not as the founding father, not only as the founding father, but also in this period of Reconstruction. While Lincoln, of course, he saved the Union from, during the Civil War. In 1876, the sentiments of using Lincoln en masse was kind of still too raw to fully celebrate that fact. He was, there were medals made in the aftermath of the Civil War that portrayed Lincoln, but kind of using him en masse in a role of celebration. I think it was too soon at that point. So there really aren't too many Lincoln medals that revolve around the United States at this period. Instead, Washington was fully embraced. And kind of going back to this fact that Lincoln wasn't necessarily fully embraced, very few other founding fathers were. As I mentioned, Washington was seen as the founding father, but there were others, even Jefferson. There are very, very few Jefferson medals that revolve around the 1876 celebrations. Washington really, really was the key persona in this circle of events. There were others. Of course, we have Martha Washington on the left here. We have a few Martha Washington pieces in the NS collection. This is one of the more really good, well-executed portrait. And then also Mount Vernon on the right. While these aren't obviously George Washington, they do relate to George Washington. So they still kind of speak to this Washington role in the wake of the American Civil War. So Philadelphia. I talk about Philadelphia because not only was the exhibition held there, but it kind of plays this role in creating an origin story, so to speak, of the United States. Throughout the early 19th century, both Philadelphia and Boston kind of quote unquote, competed as the birthplace of the United States. You can find many, publications from the 1830s, 1840s talking about Boston and Massachusetts as where the United States began. And, to some degree, there's truth to that, because, we have, Plymouth Rock and everything there. But then when you talk about the political kind of origins, then Philadelphia is where that starts. So, for the first 50 or 100 years of the United States history, you have these kind of two competing cities in who kind of founded where the United States began. Boston actually also tried to vie for, as the location for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. Of course, that didn't happen. With the event held in Philadelphia, that city as the birthplace of the country was solidified. All things Philadelphia were celebrated that year. As we can see here is an interior shot of the Declaration of Independence being signed in Philadelphia. So again, here's a medal that portrays the moment that the United States was founded, and accordingly there was no other in this mindset. So Philadelphia kind of won over Boston. Sorry Boston, but this is how it played out in the late 19th century. So Philadelphia Independence Hall, as we saw the interior of Independence Hall, here's two exterior shots. There were many other medallic representations of Independence Hall. Here just kind of two, kind of a good one on the right and a bad one on the left, well detailed on the right and not so detailed on the left. I'm not saying the one on the left is bad. I could do that good, but compared to the one on the right, it's not quite there. But there are many medals that depict this. The Liberty Bell. So kind of the third kind of topic I want to talk about is liberty. And this is kind of the first of two, the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell, and this is the inscription on it. What is the Liberty Bell? The Liberty Bell was to proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Again, that's literally what is cast into the Liberty Bell. I kind of find this to be an interesting choice because the Liberty Bell has little to do with American independence. It was actually cast in the early 1750s. It was not used to proclaim freedom in 1776, like many people think. By the 1840s and 1850s, and really, of course, by 1876, it did kind of take on this elevated status, of being, or a symbol of freedom for America and liberty. But the true origins that really didn't have a whole lot to do with American freedom in 1776. So to me, an interesting choice on all accounts, but I get it. Here's a few other representations of the Liberty Bell for medals pertaining to the 1876 Centennial exhibition. The one on the left is particularly striking for, I'm sure it's not easy to portray a metal or a bell well on a small piece of metal, but this engraver did it. The two on the right are really interesting because of the two, the one on the left doesn't have the bell cut out. It has the bell from the die still there. The one on the right, though, did have a bell cut out, and then the bell that's there is actually a three-dimensional bell that you can, jangle and everything else. However, the cool thing about the two is that they are actually struck by the same dies. The whole outer piece is the same dies from one another, but whoever made them, kind of came up with two completely different, souvenirs out of one set of dies. And if you look where the one on the far right, where the bell is attached, you can kind of see design elements from the one on the left. So cool set of pieces there. So the second kind of liberty I want to talk about is Lady Liberty / Columbia. As a figure, Lady Liberty or Columbia was not a contentious figure, unlike Lincoln, where there was kind of some raw feelings. Liberty was liberty for all, on paper, not necessarily in reality at any time, unfortunately, during American history, but that's neither here nor there. But Liberty / Columbia was used before 1876, after 1876, but certainly a high point in the medallic arts in 1876. Like Washington, she was a symbol that that either Northerner or Southerner could relate to. There were a variety of liberties used, as we'll show you in a second. There were old forms, new forms, classical forms, modern forms. As we can see, here's Columbia on the right. Here's kind of resurrection of old design. We have an actual 1782 Libertas Americana medal on the right. And then we have 1776 medal on the left that resurrects that design. Here's completely different representations, but still meant to be liberty. And there's no, unlike Washington or Lincoln, where you kind of have to portray that person, liberty being a symbol and allegorical figure. She could be portrayed in many different fashions, and that even happens within a single set of medals that revolve just around one event, this being the 1876 Centennial exhibition. So here are two completely different versions of Columbia once again. Finally, back to Lincoln. Though he was instantly considered a martyr, Lincoln was not largely represented in the 1876 Centennial like the previous three topics that I talked about which were Washington, Philadelphia, and Liberty, the two kind of forms of liberty. Lincoln, who is now considered a very, very integral part to the history of the United States and its survival. At the time, I wouldn't say he was ignored or forgotten, but just not necessarily put up on the pedestal that he would have otherwise been put on at other events, just because it was so soon after the Civil War and it was a time of celebration. So there aren't too many Abraham Lincoln medals. In fact, this one on the right is the only one that I could find in the A&S collection that deals with Lincoln and American independence, the Centennial. And oddly enough, not oddly, but ironically enough, it still mentions Washington on the back. So even though it's a Lincoln medal, they still succeed in getting Lincoln in there, or in getting Washington in there. So here's some other literature, non-numismatic literature that revolves around kind of this topic. As kind of a side note, as a numismatic researcher, it's important to not use only numismatic literature in researching, or else you're just going to be regurgitating the same information over and over. And you can find a lot of good information on numismatic topics in non-numismatic literature. So I'm going to give you a couple non-numismatic books that do talk about this topic, in case you enjoy it and want to learn more. So the first is Barry Schwartz, George Washington, The Making of an American Symbol. The second is Carol Ann Marling, George Washington Slept Here, Colonial Revivals and American Culture, 1876 to 1986. So she even starts at this kind of same 1876, this pivotal period, but goes up until really the centennial of the Statue of Liberty, which is almost arbitrary, but not quite. There are many, many other books that revolve around Washington in particular. Here is a third book that's also non-numismatic, but that does kind of get into this more contentious topics that they were kind of trying to avoid at this time. So here's a book by Jack Noe, Contesting Commemoration, the 1876 Centennial Independence Day and the Reconstruction Era South. So this is kind of dealing with that topic head on, of how do we kind of celebrate our centennial as a country, when our country almost didn't exist just a dozen years before, and at that point they kind of weren't even really over the healing process yet. So that's something that doesn't get represented whatsoever in the medallic arts, but it's absolutely was a reality for many, many people. Is how do we celebrate this when just a few years before, a good portion of people who are at that point new citizens weren't even citizens. So the 1876 centennial celebration on the surface seems like a benign kind of time period, but when you kind of dig deeper, there's a lot happening, and a lot of it has to do with healing, and not only celebrating the country, but also celebrating the fact that kind of quietly celebrating the fact that we are still a country despite, after the Civil War. So in conclusion, and this kind of regurgitates what I noted in the beginning, in 1876, the United States celebrated its centennial anniversary with an exposition in Philadelphia. However, this period was also the aftermath of the American Civil War and in the wake of the Reconstruction period. In an effort to forget the recent past while also celebrate, symbolism avoided anything related to the war, and again, to Lincoln to a large degree, and instead symbolism looked at earlier ideals, solidified a national origin story, and found new symbols to identify as important to the nation. I gave three, again, Washington, Philadelphia, and Liberty. There are others. One in particular that I didn't even mention is Native Americans. You kind of see a huge uptick in representations of Native Americans beginning in 1893, and then really even more so at the Columbian Exposition in 1893. But they were there on the Medalla Guards in 1876. So there's others as well. So thank you. Here's some contact information from me. Again, Jesse Kraft, PhD, the Resolute Americana Curator of American Numismatics at the American Numismatic Society in New York City. Here's my email address if you have any further questions that you didn't get a chance to think of during the course of this presentation and want to reach out later. So thank you. And I think that we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Jesse. That was great. Yes, if anybody has questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you can ask the questions. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that, and there were some interesting things you highlighted there. I hadn't actually seen that Lincoln medal, Jesse.
Yeah,
it's interesting that they used an early pre-Civil War portrait of him, perhaps for the same reasons that you were suggesting, that they didn't want to use the standard image with the beard because that could have been inflammatory to some degree.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't even make that connection, but yeah, that to me, as looking at that, kind of art historical approach to it, I would actually absolutely add that in there. Yeah, that's a really, really good observation. But yeah, it's interesting how now we consider Lincoln to be pivotal to anything related to American history and how we would celebrate it and look back. But at this time, it was still a kind of a hot topic. A dozen years later, even the country wasn't healed yet at this point, and obviously we kind of still aren't healed about this, unfortunately. So you can imagine what it was like 150 years ago, and just a dozen years after that fact.
Absolutely, it was. I hadn't thought of this topic in that sense before, but it actually makes very good sense, and it explains a lot of the choices that they made in what they used to celebrate, especially the Washington. But we do have a few questions. So the first one is, what about the 1876 so-called dollars?
Yeah, so-called dollars are kind of an arbitrary title, or kind of group of coins or metals, really. They're not coins, even though the word dollars are in there. They're dollar-sized metals that generally revolve around all the various expositions. You can find them for the 1876 exposition and all of them all the way up through even the World's Fair of 1964 in New York City, where they were issuing so-called dollars. So-called dollars are just one of many, hundreds, if not thousands of different varieties of metals or tokens, even coins that revolve around the 1876 exposition. So I don't know if you have anything in particular about the so-called dollars, but that's kind of what they are and what I would how I would talk about them.
And Ken Montville had a question. Did any of the designers, engravers cross over to coins?
Yeah, in fact, the official medal for the exposition was designed by George Morgan. So, I mean, you have a clear link there. There were others, I'm sure, some of the more or some of the private people may have eventually crossed over into coins. None others that I can necessarily think of off the top of my head. Maybe Anthony Paquette, maybe, he may have made something, or, he is operating around that period as well. So I'm sure that there were a couple others, but none that necessarily jump out.
Okay. And Jackson Hancock, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Oh, well, sorry, this is a thank you.
You're welcome, Jackson.
So Gamal Amr has a question. Do you see that? Okay, I also note that during the exposition, technology was celebrated, science and technology are celebrated. Do you see that as playing a role in defining the identity of the nation?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that goes hand in hand with one of these other topics. There's probably a dozen different topics that you could choose from to make a presentation. Gamal can make another presentation talking with the same exact title, but choose 3 different other things and even include technology. Technology and agriculture both go hand in hand with kind of these 2 aspects of American economy that were celebrated during the exposition. And technology in particular was important because we hadn't yet, but we were on the verge of overtaking Britain as the industrial powerhouse of the world. That happened around 1890. So 1876, we're still competing with them and really, really are trying to show our industrial might. So yeah, absolutely. That's a good point as well.
The anonymous questioner comes back with, are so-called dollars part of the collection? I presume the ANS collection is what he's talking about.
Yep. Yeah, we do have those in the collection. I think we have a few different varieties even. So yeah, we absolutely do. Unfortunately, our online representation for the ANS collection is Mantis, Mantis. The medallic art portion of Mantis isn't 100% represented. So you can do some searches on there and not necessarily find everything that we actually have in the collection. So if they're not online, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have them. So.
And Franklin Noel has a question. Any comments about the Philadelphia Exposition's focus on industry, commerce, and the envisioned future of the United States?
Yeah, I think that goes hand in hand with what I 2 questions ago, where industry, commerce, agriculture, all these different allegorical figures are kind of actually really being invented during this period. Maybe not necessarily specifically for the exposition, but for this kind of American story. You can find commerce, industry, agriculture as allegorical representations, usually in the form of a woman, but you can find them on many different medals from 1876 and after. And it's usually just something random, like agriculture will be sitting on a bale of hay or something like that. Industry will have like a gear near her, and that is enough to denote those different aspects of American economy. So yeah, that's beginning around this time as well. And yeah, just goes hand in hand with this whole story of trying to define or redefine the United States in the wake of the Civil War. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it continues the imagery that you see in the obsolete banknotes from before the war. We're very familiar with the idea of the United States was a great trading nation and all this, and I think what you said, it gets solidified during the 1876 period.
Right. Yeah. It's before. I mean, when we're in that free banking period, as you mentioned, they're on banknotes, but that doesn't necessarily, those aren't national banknotes, so that doesn't help, necessarily go towards the national story at that point. People do see and recognize, I'm sure, the significance behind them and say, yeah, of course, that denotes American, economy and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's not until, after the fact, during this 1876, where it's truly, I think, used in, as a national symbol rather than just the, the economy or on, kind of more regionalized notes and numismatic objects.
Greg Hudson has a question about were there any designers, engravers who have Southern sentiments before and after the war, so I guess involved in the 1876 medals?
I'm sure that there were. I mean, I don't know the political affiliation of all the different engravers. I'm sure that some of them came from the South, and unfortunately, I'm sure that there were, some from the North who had Southern sentiments as well. That is a phenomenon that we're beginning to understand more and more as historians. Is kind of, it's not North and South as easy. It's not as easy to divide the country up, as in that manner. So there, again, there very well could have been Northerners who felt that way, but and Southerners who felt the other way. I mean, that's a fact. I can't necessarily speak to that question in particular.
Right. He clarified a little bit by saying employed by the mint.
Got it. I'm not sure. And Greg, unless I don't know if you're trying to throw me a softball here, but
if I would presume it'd be difficult because the mint employees were largely politically
right
appointed, especially the top, and so you often had fairly big changes from administration to administration if the party changed.
Right. And also when we talk about quote unquote the mint, I mean, the mint at that point did, the New Orleans Mint, is a part of the mint to that point, and there were certainly, Southern sympathizers there. Because at one point the mint was taken over by the Confederates and stuff like that in the early 1860s. The quote unquote, when you say the mint, of course you probably mean the Philadelphia Mint, but especially when you're talking about engravers, because that's where they were employed. But I'm sure that there were mint employees in various branch mints that felt that way.
Yeah, the last question. Well, no, yes, the last question we have right now is what kind of metals were used? Asked by Ken Montville.
Oh, so many different metals. Silver, silver and bronze and brass, I would say, are the three biggies. There's a handful of gold medals out there for some of the more, for some designs. There's even some white metal. There's a lot of white metal, actually. Some aluminum. For those of you who don't know, aluminum was actually still considered a precious metal at this point until like 1890. So there are a handful of aluminum metals, but not too many. Most of the, what you might think of as an aluminum piece of this are actually, some sort of tin or white metal composite. Pretty much any metal with a T that you can think of that was being used in the metallic arts at this point were being used in specifically for medals of the 1876 expedition.
Well, that seems to be it for the questions right now. If anybody else has another last question or two, we could do that. Otherwise, this has been a great talk. Thank you very much, Jesse. It was very good and an interesting and informative discussion.
Yeah, no, I thought so as well. Yeah, again, thank you for having me. I truly appreciate the invitation, and I hope it was a good start to National Coin Week. Looking at the schedule ahead, I mean, it's going to be a great National Coin Week from what I could see. So glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you for being the opening speaker. It's been very good, and please do come back over the next 4 days for the next 4 presentations. We've got some great ones lined up, and I hope everyone enjoyed this one, and have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.